All right, so we're going to move on to our next presenter, Brent Holden, in a couple of seconds. I just wanted to introduce a couple of people. As Luke said, my name's Claude Reeves. I manage our enterprise business in Canada. There's also Richard Seguin, not the singer, but did he actually leave the room exactly when I was going to call him? Excellent. And there's Gino. Gino is actually heading up our telco. Richard, who just left, actually heads up the public sector team. So please find them and ask them questions and make them work today. So there's a couple of key points that David mentioned. One of the things that struck me is simple things. His idea about what they were doing in the restaurants in the airport, which sadly I see a lot of those things because I'm in airports a lot. It's amazing that some of the biggest changes and some of the ways companies can make the biggest change is not by trying to reinvent the world. It's by just incremental improvements. But those incremental improvements have to be timely. That's where DevOps comes in and all that sort of stuff. So I found that very interesting. So I'm going to introduce Brent Holden, our CTO in North America here. Brent and I have known each other about 7 years now. And when I started with Red Hat, every problem you have in this room, I was going to solve with Linux. That was pretty much my philosophy. Over the last 7 years, we've evolved that a lot. And I think in a couple of minutes, you'll be a little odd at the scope with which Red Hat can help and bring value to your organizations. That's what Brent will show us.
David also mentioned that the data scientists in the room with like the cloak and the lightning bolt in the background. That's Claude's office, by the way. Excuse me. So my name is Brent Holden. I'm the CTO of North America for Red Hat. So my colleague, Mike Bursell, this is our second Red Hat day this week. We did one in Montreal. He started off with a really terrible joke in French in Montreal. I'm going to start off with a really terrible joke in English today. All right. So what do you call a psychic dwarf who has just escaped prison? Does anybody know? Yes?
A small, medium, and large.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, the man. You get a hat. You're going to get one afterwards. Okay, so, terrific. I've been at Red Hat for about 10 years. It's a totally different company than when I started, a completely different company. As Claude mentioned, when I first got here, we had just closed on JBoss. We had just acquired them. They weren't really well integrated yet, so we really only had two products and maybe a distant third. It was really about RHEL and satellite, the OS and the management. Really, since that time, we've really evolved, and it really goes to show how much more business relevant Red Hat is, and how we're really changing how companies just change how they go to market, how they interface with their customers, how they deliver applications. So let's talk about it. Okay, so 90. I always like to start off with an interesting stat. It's a parlor trick of mine. The interesting stat is that based on a PwC Global CEO survey, 90% of CEOs were asked, or CEOs, this group that they asked, are you using technology to assess how you're delivering against shareholder expectations? 90% said yes. So there is this general expectation that you are going to use technology to deliver against shareholder expectations. The other 10% should not be a CEO. That's what that amounts to. Now, sometimes there are some people in this group that are going to say, hey, this email thing is pretty interesting. So there's people who are going to be on the laggard end of the scale, and that's okay. But generally, people understand that technology has a core function within the business, and now that perception is changing. It's changing into what we refer to as digital transformation. A digital transformation is really about using, instead of having IT be the boat anchor you carry around, IT is now being a partner and help drive the business. That's what digital transformation is all about. You're changing your process, your policy, your culture, your time to market, allowing you to compete more effectively in the digital age. So many of the, we love to point out the unicorns like Ubers, Airbnbs, and all those companies. They don't have legacy that they have to tote around. Digital transformation is such a big deal for so many enterprises because they are moving faster and they're doing so with legacy in their backyard. So this is an IDC quote. 2/3 of CEOs of Global 2000 companies have prioritized digital transformation. That number is only going to go up. An interesting corollary stat to this is that less than 20% of publicly traded companies have any sort of technologist on their shareholder board. I think that is fascinating. There is just no technology representation at the board level for most publicly traded companies. That is going to change as well. With the emphasis on technology, it's going to change. Most CEOs, they get it. They see, okay, technology is important, and they now, to a smaller extent, they're putting digital transformation, but it's also 2/3, and like I said, that number is only going to go up. So this is the world that Red Hat has to play in. These are the customers that we serve. We serve most of, if not all of, the global 2,000 companies. And so we have to go on that journey with them. And in fact, not only are we going on that with them, we're a partner with them. All right, here we go. Next slide. So I talk to a metric ton of customers. I mean, that's my job. I basically live on the road. I'm based in Boston, but I always joke that I'm based out of Logan Airport. Really, I spend so much time talking to customers. These are the trends that I see. You just boil them all down. This is it. Problem number one, customers want to deliver applications faster. That's always been the case. But now I think the technology is there along with sort of a guideline for cultural change. Right? So problem number one. Problem number two is they want platform of choice. Now I've seen a lot of customers talk about how they want to get out of the data center business. I heard that phrase like probably every meeting I go to. There's very few customers that are opening up new data centers. They're looking at public cloud as the answer to their data center woes. And I'd say that maybe sometimes that's not always the case. Customers haven't necessarily always run through those cost models yet. But I'd say providing choice is paramount to what Red Hat does. We want to give you the flexibility to do whatever you need to do, what's best for your business. The third is about automation augmenting people. I attended the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium, and that went on right around like 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago now. When they talked about, so it was a whole day at the CIO level. The whole day was spent talking about automation, almost the whole day. I mean, every single talk talked about it, every single panel talked about it. It's fascinating. And really what it comes down to is that automation is not going to wipe out anyone's job, at least not for the next, call it 20 years. We have not reached peak labor in either the US or Canadian markets. There's a lot of room for automation to augment human workflow. What I'd say is that at least in the short term, called the next decade or so, companies are trying to invest in automation, augmenting people, taking away the mundane tasks, the boring stuff you got to do every day. They're trying to take that off of the plates of the admins, the developers, the business analysts, data scientists. All those different groups have investments majorly into automation. And so I think that the augmenting aspect is going to be so much more important than the replacement aspect. AI, it's coming. I think the maturity of AI right now is primarily based in pattern recognition. The world building stuff, like just doing anything beyond pattern recognition, that's slow going still. So augmentation for now, for sure. The fourth problem I see is cultural change. So we had Red Hat Summit, I think Luke mentioned it in May, and the cultural change aspect is not to be underestimated because every single conversation, and I mean every single conversation I had at Summit, was around, hey, all this new stuff is great. We love how you have new stuff. We love how it can help solve all these problems. We just can't adopt it yet. And so when it comes to cultural change, I think that Red Hat needs to help our customers through that journey. We need to help our customers understand what cultural change is, how they can put it in place, how it affects how they organize. All those are really important problems. Cultural change and strategy, it just goes hand in hand with technology. You're not going to be able to do the technology without addressing the cultural issues. I can say that from personal experience with OpenStack, OpenShift, Ansible, basically the entire stack. You're not going to be able to adopt any of it unless you really think about it in a bigger way. Okay, so IT is evolving. I'd say Red Hat traditionally has been a very, what we call a horizontal company. We used to give you an operating system and say, hey, go figure it out. That's we used to always joke it was just the bag of Legos. And so the things that Red Hat's trying to do is become more industry specific, at least understand industry problems, because there's no technology that's being put in place that does not solve a business problem. That's sort of the other side of that CEO coin, is that they want to invest in technology, it has to be business relevant. And so the most business relevant stuff that Red Hat's doing, at least on a broader scale, is in these major functional areas. So we're investing very heavily within government. You saw that, and I think Mr. Carty, actually Luke introduced me as Mike Carty. I don't know where you are, Mike. Oh, there he is. So Luke introduced me as Mike Hardy up here. I don't know what you got to do. Mike has been working with the British government, specifically BC Hydro, talking about, or just the province, talking about how they can enable citizen development, enable a different model within a government. I think that's a fascinating thing. I've never seen that done within a government agency, even within the US. They're a terrific reference that I'm sure Mike is going to bring up later. Telco is also another major area for Red Hat. Most telcos are completely revamping infrastructure. I remember when I was an operator, 20 years ago or so, and I got my first tour of, at that point it was still Bell Atlantic. And so I went in the basement, I got a tour of Bell Atlantic. Hey, this is where your frame goes into the cloud. At that point, it was the frame relay cloud. This is where your frame goes into the cloud, and it was all these like digital, like clack, 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 all these crazy mechanical switches. Telco has evolved from that to doing things in a more computer-driven way, and more network switches, and now everything's being driven to the virtual environments. Telco is going through a huge modernization phase. It's going to affect everybody, all the way down to what kind of mobile device you're able to use. Retail is probably the third biggest area. I see a lot of churn within retail, especially for traditional retailers. Traditional retailers now, especially in the US, like companies like Sears and Macy's, those places are imploding. Anything that's brick and mortar that does not have a very strong digital strategy, they're not going to be in business for very longer. Let's just be honest about that. And the last is finance. Finance has always been a terrific Red Hat segment, and it's primarily because finance has always been very performance driven. Red Hat's original value prop, the day I got to Red Hat, the value prop of Red Hat was, compared to Sun, twice the performance, half the price. That was our value prop. I think generally speaking, we still live up to that, especially compared to proprietary. Finance was very keen on that. They were very performance driven. So Red Hat is a performance driven platform. Okay, as far as specific initiatives that we have, the airlines are one. I think everyone's had to deal with, if you travel at all, I travel a ton. I think I put on like 100,000 miles domestic, which is gross. If you travel a lot, you've seen outages from Delta, United, JetBlue, Southwest, you name it, I fly them, and there's been outages on all of them that have affected me personally. And so the airlines have gone through this undergoing this tremendous modernization effort. That's another big industry that we're working with. NFV is what the telcos are using. It's called network function virtualization. If you're not in a telco, you probably don't care about it. But that is the platform that most telcos are going to. NFV is actually driving a lot of emerging technology for the customer segment. They're working out the operationalization problems associated with a lot of emerging technology. So even though it may not be specifically relevant to your business, definitely relevant to you when it comes to trying to figure out those, like what we call day two problems, those operational problems. Most healthcare companies, healthcare in the US and Canada is obviously a little different. Healthcare in the US is just this, it's a million different islands that don't talk to each other. We're trying to help solve those problems through electronic medical records and standards-based applications. And the government. So I think the US government is a very large customer of Red Hat's in multiple departments. And now we're trying to do the same thing with Canada. All that's being driven. If you talk to customers, why they adopt Red Hat, generally speaking, is because they can save money up front through commoditization, and then we can help them move to the next stage, help them move to the next platform. So that's generally what it's all about. Customers like going through that commoditization effort. They have to show value, they have to show ROI, and they want to get some of that budget back so that they can reinvest into innovation. And that's where Red Hat plays. So here's our vision. Here's the short and sweet of it. Our vision 10 years ago was vastly different. Here's our vision today. Any application, any environment, no lock-in, that's what we want to enable. We want to enable you to run your applications wherever you want. And it's really the world is application-centric. And that's kind of a bummer for Red Hat, being that we're primarily an infrastructure company that falls back on Linux a lot. If you talk to any sort of executive, they don't really care, like, what is the OS doing? It doesn't matter. They care about, is the application up? That's their number one concern. So applications really rule the universe. If you talk to a lot of business, that's all they care about. And so our goal is really to enable applications, application development, make people more efficient, make people, just make people's lives easier. No lock-in. I think that's a really important point. That's always been a core tenet for Red Hat since I've been here, and this will continue in perpetuity. Red Hat has been an open source company. I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes why Red Hat's an open source company. So we have these two tenets really. When I talked about when I first got here, it was really the two pillars of technology. So we had Enterprise Linux and we had JBoss. Now for a long time it was, hey, if you got AIX, Sun, IRIX, let's move on to Linux, save you a bunch of money. And the other side of that coin was, hey, if you got WebSphere, WebLogic, let us help you move to JBoss middleware. It was really more of a cost play, just making people's budgets more efficient. That's why RHEL and JBoss are so prevalent in the market today, is because they solve real budget problems. Something to consider is that maybe by accident, maybe it just happened through the industry, because it's open source, because we're an open source based company, this is where people have chosen to build on, and it's where all the innovation is happening. I think this is a really important point because this is bedrock for us, but this is not the end of Red Hat's story. This was our story 10 years ago. Now again, going back to Red Hat being an infrastructure-centric company, the good old days were Linux is the foundation, run wherever. So you have physical, virtual, private, public cloud. That's great. That's still part and parcel to Red Hat's story. We want to enable that flexibility. It's not our story today. Really, here's the model. We want to enable what we call open hybrid cloud. This is what customers have been asking for. They want to look at things like, the application platform. They want to look at whatever infrastructure platform it is. They don't really care if it's on-prem, off-prem. They just want to make sure they meet their regulatory requirements. They need to stop paying what I would call the EMC and NetApp tax. When it comes to things like big data, so David pointed out that big data and analytics is one of the top areas of CEO investment. A lot of that is being driven by software-defined storage. Generally speaking, if you have a lot of data in-house and you're putting it onto an EMC array, you're racking up costs probably quicker than you want. I mean, that's a universal truth. I've never met a customer who's like, yeah, I'd love to cut EMC another check. This doesn't happen. So really it's about investing in new technology to keep data around, make it integrate with the data analytics platform. That's where Red Hat software-defined storage comes in. The last piece is really around management and automation. So if you look at every single one of these layers, Red Hat has made major acquisitions in all of them. I think Luke mentioned CodeEnvy, talking about developer tooling. That's part of what we call Openshift IO. That's our online OpenShift platform. And it's about making people more effective as a developer. The second is the application tier, the application platform. We created OpenShift. That was something that was a Red Hat generated project. We acquired other companies. We acquired another company called Makara. Probably none of you remember that name, and frankly, their code was not that interesting. But definitely the idea was really interesting. Platform as a service, as David mentioned, it absolutely is a digital transformation enabler. It's something that Red Hat is really investing in very heavily. OpenShift is driving so much of the Red Hat story today. Around infrastructure platforms, we invested very heavily into something like OpenStack. OpenStack is really, like I mentioned with telco, that's where the adoption is primarily. With software-defined storage, we acquired both Gluster and Inktank. And the reason why being that now that we have software-defined storage, we can enable really interesting use cases like hyperconverged. So it's eating all the parts of the machine, not buying a server, loading it up with 2 terabytes of disk space and then never using it. We're using it only for cache. It's really kind of a waste of money. You want to use as much of that machine as possible. The management and automation piece, I think, is not to be underestimated. If I talk to customers, what they're most interested in, as I mentioned, the automation piece is something that always comes up. They're looking to bring that mundane stuff out of your daily workflow. They want to make you easily, the most effective employee, IT work, knowledge worker that you can be. Automation's a big part of that story, and having management and visibility into a multi-cloud scenario, that's what Red Hat wants to enable. So when it comes down to actual brass tacks of what technologies enable this, so I talked a little about Openshift IO. Openshift IO was something that we announced at Summit this year. It's really just, if you think about it like a web-hosted Eclipse, well, maybe not everybody. Most people know what Eclipse is. It's an integrated development environment. It's hosted online. We have an automatic pipeline into OpenShift. What that means is that it has a big ecosystem. The developer experience with OpenShift is top-notch, and it's something that, as long as you have connectivity, which, even I can get a connectivity, at 35,000 feet. As long as you have connectivity, you're good to go. It's a terrific platform for developing and integrating with a development environment. Ansible is really driving so much of our automation story. If I were to pick out every single one of the Red Hat product stack, looking at how we deploy, how we manage, how we patch, how we reconcile against security problems, it's all being driven by Ansible. That whole story is being driven by Ansible. When Luke mentioned that it was one of the most successful Red Hat acquisitions ever, one of the reasons that it was so successful is one, because of the customer drag, but two, because it just has wide applicability to the entire Red Hat portfolio. There's so much of what's going on. And one of the things that we have going on is between CloudForms, giving that multi-product story, allowing you to use Ansible across multiple public cloud providers, integrating into what we call Red Hat Insights. Red Hat Insights is our way of looking at your systems, determining if there's going to be problems ahead of time, and then issuing you an Ansible playbook to then go remediate it. It's pretty slick stuff. The one area it's not in yet is Red Hat Satellite. So if you kind of read the tea leaves, it's going in everywhere else. The one place it's not in, Satellite. There's no commitment there, at least for me, not on stage. I think up front you can probably check us out in a year. The other parts of the portfolio, if you look at it from coming from the outside in, so Red Hat Enterprise Linux, we still look at RHEL, as I mentioned, the foundation of most of what we do. RHEL is still the area that, if you look at all the different new emerging technologies that have come out, Docker, you saw the chart from David, the uptake and just the traction that Docker has is tremendous. Red Hat's one of the largest contributors, the second largest contributor to Docker. That technology was born within Linux. All the new software-defined networking capabilities that people talk about, all that stuff was born in Linux. All the new security technologies people talk about, that stuff was born in Linux. There's so many things that are just born in a deep layer of the operating system that we're now exposing to our customers in the form of automation, making it easier to use, helping to make your environment more secure. That's what Red Hat's trying to do, and that's why Red Hat Enterprise Linux is still a big foundation of what we do. When it comes to different other technologies like Red Hat virtualization, so most folks in the room, you probably know VMware. I don't think I've ever met an operator who didn't use VMware. It's okay, yeah, we can admit that. I think that mic is on. It's causing me some issues. When it comes to something like VMware, customers love it. I have 0 customers who think it's a terrible platform. What they don't like is the cost tag associated with it, especially when it comes to investing in emerging technologies. Makes it a very difficult play and something that's more difficult to justify when it comes to things like software-defined networking, integrating these new emerging technologies on top of it. It's a great platform, it's just expensive. So Red Hat virtualization, as I mentioned, is part of the Red Hat commoditization story. We're there to help you out with the budgetary problems associated with just commodity virtualization. Where customers are looking at investing in is something like OpenStack. And like I mentioned, David pointed out that OpenStack is kind of seen, it went through the trough of disillusionment, I would call it. And people looked at it, they said, hey, this is cool, this is the data center API. And then it had a lot of isms. One of the isms is that it took a PhD to operate. At least 4 years ago, it could be painful. And so what Red Hat's done is really done a lot of great work with the telcos, the people adopting OpenStack that had a very strong business case for it. That's who we're working with. And that's, they're driving out a lot of those operational issues. And so now you don't need a PhD to operate it. You can bring it on-prem, and you can provide Amazon-type services on-prem through the platform. That's a really compelling story for customers who, if you just think about OpenStack as substrate on top of your hardware infrastructure, what that means is that you have just one API to manage infrastructure, manage provisioning, manage scaling, and that's something that OpenShift can sit on top of. Now, OpenShift is how, so I mentioned substrate on top of hardware. OpenShift is really the substrate on top of these multiple cloud providers, OpenStack being one, VMware being another, Google, Azure, or Amazon probably being the leader in that space. Those are things that we want to enable. We want to give customers the most flexibility, and so OpenShift is that flexibility. Really what drove a lot of container adoption was the portability. It was strictly portability. Nobody really cared about, this cool technology primitive. It's just, as a container in a technology, Red Hat thought we had that problem solved. With LXC like 7 years ago, we're like, oh yeah, this is great. Everyone's going to use this. It didn't get a lot of adoption because the problem that we didn't solve and the problem that was solved with the new container ecosystem around Docker was portability. That's generally what it is. I mean, we've used containers. We've been working with Google and IBM and all those other providers for almost a decade using containers. It was the portability aspect. And so that's really what drives the OpenShift story is the portability aspect, understanding that you can use one technology on Google, one technology on VMware. It's the same piece of technology. It's the same software. It's a really compelling vision for a lot of customers who, when you have developers creating things on their laptop or they're creating things using Openshift IO, they create their business logic and they're able to push into the platform. And they're able to reuse that same pattern over and over again because all they're doing is using business logic. They're creating their application code. And that's, I think, the second value prop around OpenShift, which is that OpenShift is really about enabling a manufacturing style adoption within IT. Now, before I get to Red Hat, I actually worked in manufacturing for like 4 years. And one of my insights from that experience to OpenShift is that when it comes to manufacturing, they're very strictly regimented around like you need to have one standard, and then you're just going to repeat that standard over and over and over again. And IT was the opposite of that. When I got back into IT, it was just tell me if this scenario sounds familiar. You have 3,000 instances of SQL Server that are all completely different. So everyone's like, yeah, okay, I know what that means, right? It's so common, and people are trying to get away from that. It's terrible. It's terrible to manage, it's terrible to audit, it's terrible to secure, it's just terrible all around. There's very low efficiency to be gained from that type of environment. Where you gain the efficiency is when you have one pattern and you just stamp it out. That's what OpenShift allows you to do. That's why containers are so popular now, because it's the one pattern, allows you to stamp it out. As an IT organization, you can offer up a set of standards for your developers and say, here's what we got, here's the toolkits that we've approved, and then they just stamp out applications based on those. If they need something more, they have to go through a review board process. That, I think, is a tremendous value add for OpenShift, and it does make auditing security much easier because of that. Our middleware story is really driving. I mentioned the two pillars at the beginning. Our middleware story is really driving so much of what's relevant because, like I mentioned at the beginning, applications are king in the environments now. Infrastructure is great. You need it. It's got to run. It's got to be stable. It's got to be reliable. It's got to be secure. Red Hat can help you do all those things. When it comes to like what people really care about, it's the application. And so we need to enable really great applications to be created. And that's where the middleware portfolio comes in. So the middleware portfolio was originally just application server. It's since diversified. We offer something called software collections now, which mean that you can use very modern toolkits. So if you want to get away from a Java stack into something more particular like Node.js, we can help you enable that. So that's it as far as the multi-cloud scenario goes. This is Red Hat's vision. This is what we're trying to deliver against customers, making you faster, more capable, and pick the platform. Those 4 problems I pointed out at the beginning, those 4 technical trends, this is the first time in Red Hat history, this year, it's the first time in Red Hat history that we can solve all 4 of those problems. It used to be that we could solve 2, we start with 1, now there's 2. Then there was, we could factor in like the automation portion of it. Now we're also addressing the cultural portion as well. Having this stack, the Red Hat stack we would call it, this is not going to go well unless you have the necessary cultural change along with it. And my colleague, Mike Walker, is going to talk about that in a little bit. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned why this is, I'm disappointed. The PowerPoint didn't have the cool animation associated with it. So you'll have to imagine it. So what makes Red Hat different? I'll tell you the skinny of what. There's so many things that make Red Hat different. It's a different type of company. I mean, Jim wrote this book called The Open Org about our culture and how different we operate and how we're really kind of like he called a bottom-up type culture. We give everyone a voice and it's great. It's really born out of our innovation model. Our innovation model is based in open source. Now, if you go to your traditional proprietary company and you say, hey, we need something new, they'll lock 20 to 30 people in a room for a couple weeks, and they crank out this new project, or they think of a new idea, and they come out and they build it, and they have their own schedule, and that's how they deliver it. It's usually something that's very internally focused. The Red Hat model is very different. Using open source, we work directly with customers out in the community to solve problems that are directly relevant to them. And that's a very different model, and it's why Red Hat is the only open source, it's the only successful open source company. If you took Red Hat and if you broke out JBoss from our company, we would be the #1 and #2 open source companies by a country mile. It just wouldn't be even being any close. And it's because we've really embraced the innovation model around open source. And so open source is driving so many of these different use cases. It used to just be, like I mentioned, just infrastructure. Now, people are looking at, how do I use open source for big data? I'm sure most people in the room have heard of Hadoop. Most people in the room have heard of Android. You use it on your phone. Most people in the room have heard of Java. All those things are open source. And they're open source because it's so much easier to innovate. If you look at, I went to VMworld. I think this is very telling for VMware. I went to VMworld in 2014, so now it's like 2.5 years ago. And Pat Gelsinger gets up on stage, and he's talking about all the cool new things that VMware has. Hey, we've got a new version of the VMware that it's just a new version for a product that's been out for 10 years. We've got this new rebranding of our cloud technologies that we're going to rebrand at vRealize. And by the way, all the investments we're making are into Cloud Foundry, they're into Kubernetes, they're into Docker. He mentioned 4 different products. Every single one of them are open source. Every single one of them. And that's from one of the most hardcore proprietary companies that exists. If you talk to the folks at Microsoft, I was in a meeting with them. Here's what they said. They said, Microsoft's an open source company now. I almost fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe it. Who do they think they are? Holding our box product up. This is the enemy. So I mean, everyone, at least all the vendors know, open source is where the world is going. Innovation is where it's coming from. People innovate much more quickly on open source than they do anywhere else. It's just the reality of the world now. So what Red Hat does to make this innovation consumable, because working directly with upstream, it can get hairy. I mean, Red Hat does this for a living, and I did it for a long time as well. It gets very hairy very quickly. There's all sorts of sharp edges, and there's some technologies out there that are more like a bag of razor blades than anything else. And so, to make those consumable, we think about it in terms of, we start with the customer. How's the customer using it? So even though our productization model, we take upstream, we take that into a sponsored project, we then productize that later. It goes through a traditional productization process. Our development process is not that much different from a proprietary software company. What's different is that it all happens in the community, and it's all open source. It's very different. Most companies have trouble wrapping their mind around that. So we take that, we make sure that we can provide a supportable experience that's secure. We make sure we can provide SLAs. There's something that I've learned since being at Red Hat. It's that Red Hat does not ship anything it doesn't understand. We need to have an expert or multiple experts in any given technology area before we're comfortable shipping it. And they need to be able to look in the community and say, yeah, that's good to ship. There's a lot of other open source companies that are out there that they'll take whatever's upstream and they'll say, hey, good to go, yeah, supportable. And the problem is that it puts customers in a bind when it's not. Or they're looking for what they assume would be support, and it's not something they can support because they don't have any thought leadership around it. The community development model is very different than a proprietary development model. You have to really have thought leadership in these communities to even play around. And so Red Hat makes a big investment in upstream communities. We take that, we make another big investment into QA, QE, making sure that you have a great experience with each of these technologies, and then we put into a customer solution. Red Hat has, I'm not sure if many of you are aware of this, Red Hat has the second largest number of ISVs behind Microsoft, and we have the largest number of IHVs ever of any company. Linux plays everywhere, and we play with almost as many people as Microsoft, although their ecosystem is slightly larger. Okay, so where to next? You're probably wondering where this is going, and frankly, I've only got about 5 more minutes. So where to next? So Red Hat is going to, so we're going to continue to innovate on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. We talked about that, how it's the basis of so many things that we do. We're looking at that to enable true hybrid cloud infrastructure. Now, we're using Openshift as really the basis for how we're taking customers into multi-cloud environment. Some of the challenges that you might run into now are that if you want to use services from, let's say you want to use AI or machine learning from Google, and you want Amazon to do basic hosting for you, and you want to have some things hosted on Azure because they're Windows-centric, and you want all those things to talk to each other, that's a nightmare scenario right now. because those things were not, those platforms, they don't want you talking to each other because, well, they want you using all them. They don't really want you, diversifying. But most customers believe very strongly they need to diversify. I have very few customers saying, yeah, we're all in on Amazon. Every single customer, even if the majority of workloads are going to Amazon, they say, we're going to maintain some secondary footprints on Azure and Google just to have an out strategy. That's very common. So we want to enable hybrid cloud infrastructure. It's a big emphasis of ours. The third is around containers. Now, containers are obviously, in high adoption today. We're making big investments in containers. Part of it is that, the container world right now, most of you know Docker. Docker split into both Docker and Moby. So now there is an open source community name. There's their proprietary technology name. What we're doing is we're creating Docker is the de facto standard that we support. And I think the world's kind of looking at that. We're investing very heavily into things like Open Container Initiative to provide not just a de facto standard, but an ISO standard around containers. Something that you can rely on that makes sure that you're future-proofed. So that way, if Docker's not here in 3 years, you know that your environment's not going to go away. And Red Hat stands behind those technologies. We're also making big investments into the security of containers. So being able to do things like scanning, understanding what's in the container, understanding traceability and performance, being able to really look at not just a particular application or a particular circuit breaker, but really being able to look from the application all the way down to the infrastructure, give you a great idea of exactly where the problem is. That's what we're doing. So all that's being driven because of containers. It's sort of secondary to containers, but I would say that containers enable us to do that type of introspection for the infrastructure. Okay, so we have Red Hat storage for modern scale storage, and we talked about Gluster and Ceph. OpenStack is really providing that common API around data center management, as well as Red Hat virtualization to take care of those commodity virtualization problems where you don't want to pay the VMware tax. And the applications of tomorrow, so I bring up these two technologies. When I go to a customer meeting, these two technologies always come up, always. Here's why I think that is. It's because when you talk about what's valuable to a CIO, they look at strategic revenue. How can we increase revenue and partner with our business? That's one. The second is how can we go faster? So part of that is enabled by automation. And Red Hat OpenShift and Ansible both implement automation in different layers. But I think really what it comes down to is people. If you look at the majority of spend within the IT department, the vast majority is people cost. The vast majority, I mean, the software spend and hardware, they don't even come close. And Ansible and OpenShift solve those problems in different ways. Ansible makes it so that your operations, your infrastructure teams, they're not doing the mundane anymore. They're able to do more work, do more innovative stuff, and it really gets you out of the mundane, just the tasks that you think you should automate. With OpenShift, that allows developers to focus on business logic. I've never met an executive who said, yeah, I want more developers doing config. And I've never met an operator that agreed with that either. That's a nightmare. And so we want to enable OpenShift. We want to get developers focusing on business logic, just picking out what toolkits they need and having the platform ready, set, go. That's what we want to focus on. What that means is that developer productivity goes way up. They're not playing around with config. They're not I think all of us have run into this issue. Somebody tries to roll out an application. There's some sort of config that takes people a day and a half to troubleshoot. It ends up being like one line or whatever. That happens all the time. We got to get people away from doing that type of thing. If we have these standard applications that we can just stamp out, the standard patterns, that's what we want to do with OpenShift. All that's container driven. Okay, so the last point I want to hit is around changing your culture. I'm not going to talk about this too in depth because we have Mike, who's going to be on stage in maybe an hour or two, talking about changing culture, how Red Hat can help do that. We've worked with so many customers, and we have some references that Mike's going to talk about, talking about changing culture around not just adopting DevOps, but how to better innovate, how to partner with the business, how to accelerate your time to market. So it's part of it's using the tools, part of it's being a better partner to the business. All right. Oh, here we go. Oh, man, I missed my slide. There we go. Back. Yes. Okay, so we have a ton of customers. These are just a snapshot of some of our Innovation Award winners. I figured I'd give them honorable mention. See a couple of them on here. Yeah, Target. Claude was telling me earlier that Target's not exactly a healthy name in Canada, I guess. Oh, well. They're not that bad. Okay, so we're going to talk about a couple of customers. First, I want to point out that Red Hat, I mean, we have to play nice with everybody. We don't own the enterprise. I'm not going to say something so arrogant as that. But I would say that we have 100%, when it comes to customers that we have or established relationships with customers, 100% of the airlines rely on us, 100% of the telcos rely on us, 100% of healthcare, and 100% of commercial banks, as well as the US executive departments. Those are fantastic numbers. We're really proud of those. We work very hard for that. Red Hat is enterprise grade, and so this is just proof. I'll spend literally a minute, because that's all I have left, and then I want to take some questions. Spend just a minute talking about some of our Red Hat customers. We have Avianca. One technology that I didn't talk about in particular was JBoss Fuse. This was an acquisition we made probably around 4 years ago. I can't believe it's been 4 years. We acquired Fuse, which is really an integration technology. So Avianca, they're one of the world's oldest airlines. They're the oldest airline in the Americas. And when they acquire smaller airlines to bring into their fold, they want to provide a very seamless customer experience. I'm sure nobody in this room has had that problem ever before. You know, M&A, you have these disparate customer databases. You know, it's always a nightmare. And so Avianca, they use Fuse, and they provide that seamless customer experience. That's how they integrate those multiple customer experiences in. So that's one. The second is Optima. Optima is a function of United Health Group. They're the technology arm. United Health Group is a Fortune 6 company. So they're one of the biggest in the world. So, I mean, they rely very heavily on Red Hat. They were looking to, again, look at the developer productivity problem. They had to solve that problem. They have developers that they're developing things on, computers under their desk or their laptops, or, they'd go out to Amazon, just spin up random machines. They needed a single platform to make the consistent more experience, make it easier so they could get applications in production, and also secure their environment. Because frankly, they just had stuff all over the place. They have 10,000 developers, and they chose Openshift for that platform. That's another win that we're very proud of. We had John Hodgson on stage with us at Summit this year. I think that really says a lot about Red Hat's scale, as well as our ability to solve problems for a specific vertical. Third customer is KeyBank. This is another vertically led customer. They're a commercial bank within the Midwest in the United States. They're highly regulated. All the commercial banks are highly regulated, as you'd expect. I mean, kind of like people in the United States kind of balk at regulation. I'm kind of happy that they're regulated. And they chose KeyBank because it allows them to solve problems in a faster way, and they can meet the regulatory requirement expectations, and it passes security audit. Those are things that only Red Hat could do. Only Red Hat can do that for them. We were in a bake-off with several other technologies, and we just beat them out. That's it. So they're looking at OpenShift on-prem is how they primarily use it. It's an embarrassingly small footprint because they took an environment of what was 70 machines and collapsed it down for their core banking application. So they run their tier 1 app, runs on OpenShift, and now that footprint is expanding wildly just because of the success they had with basically their biggest and hairiest app. And that's it. So we have the portfolio and the model to deliver what customers need. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions.
All right, thanks, Brent. Does this work? This mic? No.
No,
Hello,
not yet.
hello.
Nobody wants to hear you anyway.
Does anybody have any questions? Brent has tremendous experience with Red Hat, so it's a good time to pick his brain. We have a few minutes. Anybody? I think you just awed them.
No dice?
I think the word is awe.
All right, well, I'll be around all day, I promise. So you can come and catch me. Like I said, I'm also on Twitter. The function of Twitter is to talk trash. I've been on Twitter for about a decade. That's its only function. So yeah, if you want to find me online, I'm brent@redhat.com or Brent Holden on Twitter.
So you're a trash talker on Twitter.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right.
I'm not as nice online. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Claude.
What we're going to do, we're going to take a break in a couple of seconds, but a couple key points, housekeeping items. If you want to do anything on social media, tweet or trash talk, if you're into that, it's at Red Hat Day or hashtag Red Hat Day. So feel free to tweet or whatever social media is your kick. I'm still trying to figure it out myself. There's a couple of interesting points that I wanted to make. When Brent was talking about open source, there's a key thing that I think people don't quite understand. When Red Hat says open source, we're committed to it in a way that I think surprises people. we've spent hundreds of millions of dollars acquiring companies over the last few years. Hundreds of millions, right? Every company that we acquire, all the technology we acquire, if it's not open source, it is made open source within 1 to 2 years. Manage IQ was a proprietary software. It became CloudForms, and then we initiated the Manage IQ open source project community, and it is a dynamic community. You look at Ansible, we're working very hard on the Ansible side. Rev, our virtualization technology, had proprietary pieces to it. It became open source as overt. So it's one thing to talk. Red Hat follows through with money. We acquire companies, and then we invest more to put them back out there, because we know the only way to continue is to have that open source approach and live it end to end. So that was one key point. The other thing is just, we talked about some references. Some of these were big companies, Europe, the US, and some other places. Beside you at your table in this room are some very, very significant Red Hat customers using a wide range of our technology. So you don't have to go very far to find people who have gone through a lot with Red Hat, have solved some very, very interesting problems. So reach out to your Red Hat representatives here, and they'll be able to connect you with a wide range of customers who have done some very, very interesting things already, whether it be OpenShift. On the panel today, we're going to have multiple customers who have implemented OpenShift, OpenStack, Red Hat virtualization, a variety of technologies. So with that, we're going to take a 15-minute break. So that brings us back here at 10:35. And hope everyone's having a good morning so far. I'll see you all in 15 minutes.